let's introduce, we have Dr. Swanholm here with us. There's a lot of your clients you've spoken with. Kenneth Reese says, Dr. Swanholm, you are the best. Someone says, I have an appointment with you on the 26th. Another gentleman said that he just got his rating award not too long ago with for his mental health claim based off of you. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have Dr. Eric Swanholm, the man, myth, and legend with us. Please introduce yourself and give us a little background. School that you went to, a little bit about yourself, how long you've been practicing, and what kind of got you into working with veterans.
Oh, sure. So I'm Dr. Eric Swanholm. I'm a clinical psychologist. I got my doctorate from UT Southwestern Medical Center, finishing up in 2011. I focused in health psychology and working with chronic pain. Kind of what got me into working with veterans is I come from a military family. So kind of learning more about that, it's a very meaningful area for me, and enjoy doing it. And I feel very good about every person I work with in terms of doing everything I can to be of help to them. Any Questions or anything I can?
Awesome. So we'll start filling some questions. So one interesting point, we saw one of the older videos you had done, chronic pain, somatic symptom. It's one of the big ticket items that most people are talking about now. But you've been involved in the area of psychology that deals with chronic pain. So for those that may not know, can you just kind of give a quick primer on what is chronic pain, what some call a lifestyle impact claim, and truly what somatic symptom disorder is?
Sure. So chronic pain is, just by definition, persistent pain that's ongoing for at least, 3 to 6 months. And in terms of somatic symptom disorder, well, and chronic pain can really, come from a variety of places. It can be migraine headaches. It can be secondary pain related to neuropathy associated with diabetes, classic back pain, many other different things. But when where it gets like symptom disorder is when a person's life or functioning is impacted, mobility is impacted, ability to engage with family members. Over time, those things can take a toll in terms of self-esteem, lead to symptoms of depression, and over time that can develop into a separate kind of psychiatric diagnosis. But it's still valid in its own sense of, really, if a person has pain, their ability to engage life changes, and that understandably can lead to a number of different psychological symptoms.
Okay. And now, so in the area of psychology, one of the things I think when we talked initially before coming on the show before last week, a lot of psychologists are not versed, I am assuming. So in the area, we had some individuals that would reach out, let's say, go to CMP, and let's say an examiner's like, well, what is this? Or they're not aware of it, right? Is that something, what's your assessment in the field when it comes to that?
Really, almost a majority of people that I evaluate or have worked with don't have a good sense or haven't made the connection in terms of how pain really is impacting multiple areas of life and sort of the psyche in the basic sense. I do my best with every person that I speak with to kind of educate them or go over their diagnoses and specifically kind of track for them, how this looks in terms of somatic symptom disorder for you. Hopefully that's kind of answering your question.
Yeah, no, it is. I think it's good to kind of really set the stage for a lot of veterans, because many in the area, we have quite a few that are actually watching now, and they'll watch it afterward, have had a psychological evaluation. Some are in the process. We have new veterans that have not spoken to their VCs yet, who may see this, and part of the strategy might be you need a psychological evaluation. So it's a good segue to bring up, in your perspective, when someone who's maybe on the fence or say, okay, why do I need a psychological evaluation? You kind of began to talk about how to prepare. So I think the value of having that evaluation versus care, which has its place. How would you explain that to someone, as far as someone say, what is a psych eval that you're doing?
Oh, sure. Really kind of the basic process is, I do kind of an interview. I ask questions about how a person person's feeling now and some history, discuss the impacts of that. Then I transition after that, to giving feedback, explaining diagnoses, kind of what the report's going to look like in terms of this is where I'm seeing your kind of overall functional impairment. And then I always give treatment suggestions also, because it's important to me not just to ask a person questions and then say, this is what I'm thinking, and then just kind of go from there. I really, with every person I talk to, I give them treatment suggestions also.
Okay. Would you be able to, last question, then I'll pass it off. If you guys are watching, listening, start posting questions you may have, and we'll start picking them up as well. From a CMP perspective, you have some experience as far as examinations leading to the VA and things of that nature. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, prior to working, with VA Claims Insiders, I mean, I worked for a very large company that's directly contracted with the VA to do the CMP evaluations that, our service kind of leads into. So that experience has certainly, informed, my ability to give an accurate kind of reading or diagnoses, and also to provide a report that will be received in a way that will be, more successful when a person goes through that process.
Understood. And I think that's a key thing to note, right? You're bringing experience from the side of the examiner's side of the house. So the person is able to not only have an evaluation, but also, get some idea of what exactly to expect in the degree. Because I think it serves as a warm up or as a trial of what to expect at the VA. If they do contract with one of the private providers, or if they use or go to the VA itself. So I think that's valuable to kind of highlight.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, and something I think I can do, more of is maybe add a portion if a person wants, some insight into preparing, for their CMP. That's certainly something I can incorporate.
Okay.
A good idea.
Yeah. So Dr. Swanholm, real quick,
Yep.
if you had to, provide one tip based off your experience of being on the CMP examiner side of the house, what would that one thing be that you could see that somebody has either struggled through that was a common denominator in that you would say, you know what, you probably best not necessarily do that?
Sure. Well, the first thing is, I mean, just the basic sort of, difficulty in, talking about what's going on or how a person's feeling. I mean, being in service, the clear stigma, talking about, any of these things at all is kind of the first barrier. But then sort of there's a lot of fear and anxiety, understandably, going into it. So initial advice being beforehand, kind of write down, make a checklist for yourself, be clear, of this is how I'm feeling. This is kind of the timeline for when this happened. If it's something, post-traumatic stress related, have a clear, concise way to explain what those events were that may have contributed to that. The kind of clear and more direct and concise a person can be, the more that someone like me, or someone who maybe doesn't listen as clearly, will be able to digest that and translate it into an accurate CMP report.
Yeah. Now, would you say that adding a little bit of emotion in there brings a little bit more reality to it?
Absolutely. I mean, not kind of I think masking that really is not going to be helpful. The other side of the coin is, it can't be so anxiety provoking going into those that a person is not able to clearly, mention or answer questions from the person. I mean, it's sort of a balance between that, genuine sort of emotion attached to the experience, symptoms be conveyed, but also keeping that, communicating that in a way that can be received by, the examiner. From having known a number of these examiners, I mean, nice people, but they kind of get entrenched in what they do, and they don't always. They can, unfortunately, they can tune out at times, which is really on them. But hopefully, that kind of answers what you're saying. Or
Yeah, no, it does. Thank you so much.
Mhm.
Absolutely. Honest, Brett?
Oh, okay, I'll go. So, well, speaking about being prepared and doing stuff, when a veteran is referred to you and is coming to have an interview with you, what would you like to see done to make sure that that veteran is prepared to talk to you?
Well, I think something that y'all do a great job of is, prepping them to just be honest and be genuine. Just feeling comfortable talking to anyone about difficult things is a barrier. But I mean, what y'all kind of preparing them that way, I think is very helpful. What I would add to that, I mean, and people are usually kind of part of what I do is like allowing space for people to talk.
Mhm.
Just being genuine and honest, and trusting that I'm not judging anyone. I mean, that's kind of often what I get, but
Mhm.
got some allergies here today.
Oh, it's all right.
But I think that's a good point to raise, because when you look at that comfort, I think one of the biggest issues veterans have is opening up to begin with, right?
Mhm.
So if you're dealing with trauma, especially as years and years, and that thing has been compounded, it's hard to talk and share things. And I think one of the values that we've heard time and time again with the different veterans we've worked with is when they have a psych eval with one of our doctors, one of the things they always come back and say is, I found out more in 60 minutes with Dr. Swan home or Dr. Sharp than the past 6-7 months of therapy. And again, I'm not saying that we are discrediting that in any shape, fashion, or form, but the way I usually phrase it to my vets is, this is almost like a forensic psychology session of sorts. Like, exactly what they're going into, because I can tell you from going to therapy and going to see different specialists, sometimes I'm the only veteran they deal with, right? So when you have a general practicing psychologist,
Right.
they may not be aware of the nuances like anything else. A doctor is a doctor, but there's a neurosurgeon, there's an orthopedic surgeon, there's different specialties. And I think when it comes to psychology, I kind of equate it the same way, where there are different specialties within psychology. You have child psychologists, you have clinical psychologists, marital couples. But when it comes to the veteran's plight, that's a whole different ball game. This is what I would say, right? So I'm also seeing your perspective on this, Dr. Swanholm. But I think that those are things that I think when they are able to have that psych eval, they're able to get more understanding and have the language to say, I didn't know I had these things until I had this conversation. But then I always tell them, now take this document and go back to therapy. Because essentially what you have now is a roadmap that you did not know or didn't know how to elaborate to that psychologist or the therapist that you went in there. And it's a simple, hey, Chris, how's your week? Oh, my week is pretty good. So it's one of those things where now this really is giving you a lot of things to unpack over a period of time.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and for me, the feedback component that I do with everyone I evaluate, I think feeds into that kind of giving greater understanding to, this is what I am seeing, this is kind of statistically what I see going on, this is what these diagnoses mean, this is kind of the functional impact that it's had, and then I transition like immediately into these are things that you could talk to a psychologist about, or these are areas or find a psychologist who has expertise in areas. And I give specific resources for that as well. But certainly, I think it brings things or sort of a concise summary or feedback definitely does help with any existing treatment or future treatment, I think.
Awesome.
I had something. Somebody brought up a point that they said, their psychologist said that SSD is rare, right? And and too many veterans are claiming SSD. I would say what is rare, right? Rare. What do you guys think is rare? Somebody that has what, one person out of 100 is rare. That seems rare to you. So if veterans are 1% of the population, if every veteran had it, it would still be
rare.
rare. So
PTSD was rare if you start considering now a Vietnam veteran who may have said, for example, in the late 80s, early 90s, I have PTSD. Well, first of all, what are you talking about, right?
yeah,
So
shell
to a
shock.
degree, well, exactly.
Right.
So that's a good question. So when did, I guess, SSD become part of the actual psychology lexicon?
Well, I mean, it used to go by a different name, pain disorder. It's got a few different like diagnostic names in the past. But in terms of, the prevalence of it, I mean, in the general population, you could say X percentage of people have it at any given time. But when you look at veteran population, I mean, what are veterans exposed to? More, frequent opportunity for injury, much less talking about in combat. So, I mean, you have a population of people who are much more likely to have injuries that will lead to functional and, the secondary or related mood, anxiety, irritability symptoms. So, I mean, I don't know why that psychologist might have said that. It may just be that they don't have as many veterans that they work with, or if you have a population of people who exposed more often to something that could lead to that, it's going to be more frequent in that population than a population. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah.
No, it makes total sense. I mean, heck, for the most part, whether it be training or just a job that you do on a regular basis, nothing is easy. Most of it is physical. It's just a very physical, demanding job. So yes, that would make sense if you hadn't dealt with a lot of veterans, and then it's like, okay, another SSD claim. Well, because we're all in pain.
Yeah. Yeah.
More ways than one.
That's the truth.
But that's why I tell, so when I have my intake calls with some of the veterans I deal with, I always make we all have their different sayings. And one of them is, in the world, in commonplace, people are always saying, 30 is the new 20 and 40 is the new 30. And that's like the fad, right? And I always joke and say, but when you're a veteran, it's the other way around. 40 is the new 50 and 50 is the new 60 and 60 is the new 70. Because when you think about it, and I use this as a way to kind of break the ice to say, the fact that you're 60 does not mean that your life has stopped. There's a 60-year-old man out there running a marathon, riding a horse, and you can barely walk because you've had 200 jumps out of an aircraft. That's not old. That's not age. That's not life. That is service on top of life, right? The same thing for trauma, right? When you're looking at, having a trauma and dealing with things, right? When life hits you, you're already starting from a disadvantage psychologically. So, these are the type of things that I think that need to be, these are the tools to be able to speak to your truth to what you're dealing with.
Yeah.
I think that's a wonderful, way to characterize that. I think that's excellent.
Hey, Doc Swan, how you doing? I just was laying back. Good. So can you explain to the folks out there, sometimes I'll have the vets come back and they'll be like, oh, wow, like I was diagnosed with 3 things on here. And then people, like, can we talk depression really quickly? Like when people come out with maybe a major depressive disorder versus like just depression intertwined with, or like somatic symptom with depressive features, right? What is the difference in those 2 diagnoses?
Sure. And that's getting into just diagnostic criteria. That's sort of, are the depressive symptoms, which, I say depressive symptoms, that's a collection of different symptoms that all have to be present to say that a person's having an episode of some type. SSD, depression, is directly linked to, the fact that a person's in pain or that their functioning has been, altered consistently or is different. With a major depressive disorder, it's very clearly defined, at least 7 days of all these sets of symptoms that can periodic kind of episodes like that. With SSD, it's very much linked to the chronic pain or kind of medical difficulties.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, certainly.
And and then it's just anxiety is pretty much, when you get a diagnosis of a general anxiety disorder versus, it's just different cause in there, different causation.
Well, I mean, and to a large degree, I mean, psychiatric diagnoses are, just kind of discrete labels for these sets of symptoms that over time people have consistently seen. So, I mean, anxiety, depression, I mean, these things overlap and they're sort of dynamically linked, but something like generalized anxiety disorder, um, that's a very elevated level of worry or nervousness that's just constantly present.
Yeah.
Anxiety related to SSD is going to wave compare or relative to sort of the functional impairment that a person's like. If someone has severe back pain and their spouse or their friends are like, let's go out to this concert or let's go out to eat or go to the mall or whatever.
Go hiking or something.
Yeah, anything. And they experience just sort of extreme anxiety about, can I do this? If I try to do it, am I going to have to leave? Are my friends going to be, or my spouse going to be annoyed that, again, I couldn't go do this thing or I had to leave? I mean, that kind of makes sense.
Yeah. Oh no, absolutely. Absolutely. That's a great example. I'm start using that example.
Mm-hmm.
We got any questions from you folks?
Oh man, you know how it is.
If diagnosed with PTSD, Doc Swanholm, is it assumed you have depression and anxiety?
Absolutely. There are depressive and anxiety related symptoms inherent to PTSD. It does get difficult to tease out when there, are different, when there's a separate depressive disorder or separate anxiety disorder. But I mean, you have sort of the panic symptoms that come with when someone's triggered by something that's related to their traumatic stressor. Or, I mean, a person doesn't even need to have a trigger, severe PTSD or even mild PTSD to have that anxiety just kind of spike right out of nowhere.
Yeah.
Mm. It's an interesting question that came in. I'm sorry, you had something, brother?
No, go ahead. My question is sad, so I'll wait.
Okay, well, wait for the sad ones. So one of my vets asked a question that's pretty interesting. So if we have constant pain, but we have a very physical job, would that hurt the claim? Because at times there are instances, and this also kind of parallels veterans that go to a CMP and the examiner says, well, Dave, you have a job, so you can't have any trauma. And we see a lot of that at times where it's like, I always argue that when you look at someone, there's a lot of people that unfortunately go down into very dark places in their lives and choose to end their lives, right? Who, for all intents and purposes, looked well. They had a job, they were married, and to classify and tell a veteran or anyone that, hey, Brett, it looks like you have it all together. You have a house and you have a car and you have a job. You can't be depressed. Coming from a psychologist, I think that is just so alarming that inference would be made, because you can argue that just because you're hanging on by a lifeline and have a job, there are many variables why you have it. Are you succeeding? Are you excelling? Are you regressing? What would you say about to things like that?
Sure. I mean, a few things. Everyone has their different ways of coping, their different abilities to cope with things. There are a lot of people who have very physically demanding jobs who are in constant severe pain, but they have learned to just push through it. And that doesn't mean that they're fine. It just means that their particular way of coping is to push through it, but that they're still progressively becoming worse physically by doing so. That doesn't mean that they're fine just because they're kind of pushing through it. Have differing levels of support from people or mental resources in terms of trying to sort of push down, PTSD symptoms over time. I mean, it's really just a very diverse sort of thing, but to try to answer that, I mean, people cope with things in different ways. And just because someone has a job or has a car doesn't mean that they're not having to adapt and adjust to some pretty severe stuff, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes total sense. I mean, not to use myself as an example, but when I went in for my CMP exam, I just got off of work and I had a shirt and tie on because that was the required attire for that job. But I've got some severe issues, right? So, but I was able to articulate that very effectively. But yeah, there is that stigma out there, right? So if you're successful, ain't nothing wrong with you. If you're highly educated, there ain't nothing wrong with you, or what could possibly be wrong, So, but what I look at it as, at times I would say more than once, even when I was in the service, I shared my stories with airmen because I was in the Air Force, but I shared my stories with service members because for the most part, we're professional suppressors. We will suppress information just to not show any weakness, primarily. So by, here comes Senior Master Sergeant Borum, and I'm letting folks know my story and why I am the way I am. And later on offline, they would come up to me and say, thank you. It's just one of those things that I didn't know I could come up and talk to you about this, or I didn't know where to go seek help for this. But we suppress so much because we don't want to stand out as a weak link. And that's how we look at it.
Well, and overcoming that, to then transition to talking to someone like me or, trying to seek any sort of help, that's one of the major barriers. I mean, it's just sort of the stigma built into even talking about emotional kind of symptoms or feeling down.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. Is it my turn? All right, Dr. Swan,
Sure.
I'm gonna put you on the spot, man. This is a hard question.
All right.
But it's a question that I think wants to be asked that nobody asks, so I'm gonna ask it. I've never been shy on this show. I've told you guys my story many of times, and one of the issues that I had going on was that at one point I had a couple of my friends commit suicide, and like I said, I've told you guys before, especially the guys in here, that I kind of turned to my wife and was like, I thought those guys had it together, so what's stopping me, right? Like I'm definitely next. My question is, when you're doing a CMP exam, because one of the questions on the DBQ is like suicidal ideation, right? When you're doing a CMP exam, a lot of veterans get worried about that because they think they're going to be committed, right? If I go into the CMP exam and say, hey man, I'm thinking, I have thought about taking my life, or I have thought about doing something, and I get vets that tell me I'm not saying it because I don't want to be committed, I don't want to be anything that can happen. I don't want to say what would it take to be committed, but what would it take if you were a CMP examiner? If I'm a veteran and I come into you and I say, Dr. Swanholm, I have thought about killing myself, is that enough to get me committed?
No.
Okay.
Really, I mean, and that is a complex question, but I mean, taking it from how would that happen? So if a person said that, I'm thinking about doing that right now, I've got the means to do it right over here or in the next room, and as we're done talking, go do that. And a few degrees below that would be something to trigger sort of a call to action for me, but really that's a very rare thing that occurs, very rare. I mean, I've never had to do that, and with anyone I've talked to, really saying that you're having those thoughts, even like, yeah, I had those thoughts this morning, and I follow up with, is there a specific plan? Is there something you're intending to do? And that leads to other questions, but there's no real risk of that unless someone's just acutely suicidal, meaning they're saying they're just about ready to do that. So in terms of feeling worried about disclosing that, that's not, unless under certain circumstances, not a realistic thing that would happen. That kind of answers your question.
Yeah, it does. Like I said, a lot of veterans, even myself, when I, at the appointments and even in therapy, right? I have a very good therapist at a vet center, which, as you guys know, I love vet centers. And it was like our first meeting. It was that question popped up: do you have any suicidal ideations? I was like, and my response was, what can I say to not be committed? And it was, you know what I mean? But it's in jest, but that is a real fear.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Oh, and, yeah. I mean, and understandably so. I've heard, prior to working, previous jobs I've had doing therapy also, I've heard from people who said they went to the VA for the first time and I've thought about killing myself, and then they immediately just got hospitalized, even, when it was. So there are a number of not good providers trigger that when it shouldn't happen, which I think, leads to that kind of apprehension of even talking about it in the first place.
Yeah, active and passive is a real thing, right, Dr. Swanholm? It's like active suicidal ideation, and passive, it's where, you can definitely tell when you think they're close, right? I mean, you can see that when you're speaking to them. Do you think like the fear of it happening is also influencing doctors, like just the fear of like being another news story, like another veteran commit suicide, and they're maybe overreacting to, where veterans are afraid to even talk about it now because they don't want to be hospitalized?
I think
I got stuff to do, right? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, and speaking to, the way other psychologists, with the VA operate, I mean, it is a crisis, nationally. I mean, I can see the overreaction kind of maybe. Hold on.
Yeah. Random subject. No, it's all right. Hey, DP, looks like you got a veteran with a win.
Sorry about that.
Who's that?
Steven, I don't know what's his last name. Breaux. He's in the watch party.
What?
Hundo.
Nice. Congrats. Awesome. Congrats to the veteran.
Good job, Steven. Don't join the watch party now. I'm sorry to interrupt the move. I was trying to lighten it up.
It's all good. Yeah, but active and passive, idle ideation or beyond that, a very, very real thing, and certainly something that.
Yeah. If I say if it wasn't for my kids, I probably would have, like, that's active, right? Or I mean, that's passive, right? Like, that's not where you're like, okay, I feel this guy loves his children and means that, he's not going to commit suicide, right? I mean, that's.
Well, so like another degree in there is if a person has a specific plan. I mean,
yeah,
people have thoughts, like that. I mean, lots and lots of people. But if a person has had a plan in the past, or if they've had recent thoughts, have they had a plan then? Then it goes to get to a point of almost trying to do that. So there are a lot of degrees in terms of suicidality, to use that word.
Yeah. And a lot of folks that have had like prior attempts, they're usually pretty forthcoming about it, right? Like with you, right? Is it kind of something that's brought up pretty quickly? I know when I get them as clients, it's like, hey, I just want to let you know. And I'm like, okay, like let's get you, an evaluation and,
Mm-hmm. I think so. One thing I was thinking while you were talking that Brett kind of brought up, the passive, right, and active, is that when it comes to some of these symptoms, they're very vague and open. So when it comes to that, it's like, for example, like we talked last time on another show, grossly inappropriate behavior. One of the things that I don't like when I'm talking to my veterans is I don't like the word keywords. I don't like keywords because it's not genuine. We're talking symptoms, and that varies. When you look at the regulation, we're looking at symptoms such as this, semicolon, that, and or. And a lot of veterans, I think, and you could probably expand on this, Dr. Swanholm, they feel like, well, Dr. Swanholm, I've looked at the rating criteria. There are things maybe at the 70 bracket that I may have, but most of my symptoms are at the 50. And that's all I want to talk about. And I don't think people understand the totality of where your symptoms are ranging and how you assess that. So can you talk about when it comes to ranges for that? Because for the evaluation that you're able to provide, you're also given an estimate based on the symptoms of where the veteran's range from a rating perspective is.
Yeah, and that's, that gets to symptom severity, because you have something like anxious mood is one of the basic symptoms on that checklist. There are a number of other kind of symptoms on that checklist that relate to severe anxiety, like sort of obsessional behaviors or panic attack, less than a few a week or, every week, something like that. So it is kind of a constellation of symptoms that vary based upon severity or to what degree they impact a person's life. So you look at grossly inappropriate behavior. That's something, that's a hard one to define, but you know it when you hear it. If that makes sense. Not sure if I'm answering your question or.
No, you are. Because I think for many veterans, right, they don't understand. And part of what we try to help the veteran understand is that there's often times when veterans look at the rating criteria, and there's a lot that are rated at 30%. Because those are the key words, right? Anxiety, some sleep issues, suspiciousness, right? Those are things that anybody says, randomly. But as you start going deeper or higher in the rating criteria, those are more vulnerable extensions of those key words, right? At the lower levels. And when someone has a conversation, it's like, well, Dr. Swanholm, I never knew, but I have this. I have spatial disorientation. I have the intermittent inability to perform daily activities of living. But I didn't think that or say that. And part of the process is understanding how the VA rates you. So we're not saying that you don't have these symptoms, but if you're not speaking to those symptoms, you're essentially doing yourself a disservice.
Oh, sure. And if a person hasn't really thought about things like this, they don't have the awareness, before y'all talk to them, or then have, someone like me follow up and ask. I mean, they might not have considered like, yes, this is going on, or I didn't really know that I'm not really taking great care of myself. I'm not showering or doing kind of basic daily activities, or, I'm neglecting that. I mean, and that's the role, the valuable role, that you all, do a great job with, and that I kind of come in to follow up on and, get greater specificity for.
So a good question has popped up. So as we're talking about this now, we're kind of peeling back the onion layer, so to speak. One of my guys said, plus also being afraid to lose our weapons. Which is a big one that comes up a lot, where individuals are like, I don't want to say anything because I might be in law enforcement or I might be in this type of job. And there's obviously different schools of thought depending on where you're at, because I think there are individuals that, putting those concerns aside, realistically are lying to themselves of probably what they're really dealing with, right? Like many times you can kind of put things away and not be real where you're at. But what would you say for some folks to think, I don't want to claim PTSD or these conditions because they're going to come take my guns away?
That's an extremely rare thing that, a diagnosis of PTSD from talking to me or someone doing a CNP, it's really not going to happen. It's a very, very rare thing that occurs. And anyone talking to me and me writing a report, whatever diagnosis may go on there, it just doesn't lead to that. From a legal standpoint, things are different, in every state. But generally speaking, I mean, unless you're in a specific job like that, where, law enforcement being a primary example, it's more of a fear that's not fully, true, as opposed to something that's going on, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's a good point, because it's just the unknown, right? I always counter some of those concerns with saying that if anything, you are reinforcing your safety net by having the conversation with a psychologist that you are fit to do a thing, because the reality is anyone can call red flag on you. You can go to a regular checkup, and if the doctor that's just checking, your cardiovascular system thinks that you might be a threat to yourself, they have a duty or obligation, if they choose to call and say, I think this person might do something. It doesn't have to be a psychologist, right? So to a degree, I always look at it like from the employment perspective. No one is saying that you're unemployable. Rather, we're saying that you have impediments. You have things that are bothering you. You have things that are truly disabling. But we have established that you are still able to manage your finance by virtue of, let's say, you making that determination, or that they are employable. Or the flip side, where, hey, Dave, you're not employable. Like, you should not be out there because you can go through the motions, but the fact is you shouldn't, which is the other side of the coin.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
All righty. Let's look to the group, man. Anybody out there in Facebook land, any questions, any concerns? Is there anybody in the watch party taking questions? I'll go back.
I haven't seen any pop up, but if you're in a Zoom party, feel free to ask some of those questions that you may have. Someone said, this is exactly why I waited so long to speak up.
Someone, that is Todd West.
I served that up. I was waiting for you to call. Right. That's why I said it that way.
Right. Todd hates me West.
So a quick backstory, Dr. Swan. The very first show we did, Todd pops up, and it was like a back and forth. And long story short, it ended up into a joke where Todd didn't like Ronis, and then the next week Ronis made a shirt that said "Todd hates me," and that became one of our slogans.
Oh, that's funny. Nice.
Yeah, I don't know. You put some respect on Todd's name.
So here's a good question, Dr. Swanholm. Once you've been rated, Kevin asked, by one of your psychologist team members, is there an expiration date or an ideal time frame that the DBQ needs to be filed to retain its full weight of influence?
I mean, really, the sooner the better. Within a year, that would be anything beyond that. You'd start to kind of wonder why the person hadn't filed before, if this was going on. I don't think there's really a specific time, or just more the sooner the better.
So here's a question. So if we held, Chris asks, that level of honesty during the PTSD due to fear, should we push for a new CMP? So again, if we withheld that level of honesty, i.e. I did not go on in there and tell my truth, I masked things, I downplayed my symptoms, going back for another CMP down the road, or filing again, obviously adding that new material evidence to show what was omitted the first time, what would you say to that?
Well, absolutely. And that gets to the value, of VA claims insiders, is that lots of people do, withhold during their first CMP or right when they exit. And then, having an evaluation like this, additional evidence, and then, with that person then going into their, future CMP with, being more disclosing, that will have a different outcome. Hopefully that kind of answered the question there.
It did.
Okay.
From within the group, is it possible for a person to become codependent on their therapist?
That's a good question.
Well, codependent is not exactly a clinical word, but dependent, that's a question you have to kind of know the specifics of the situation and kind of what's going on with the person. Sure, that can certainly happen. What, I don't like to use the word should, but what should happen in that case is the psychologist or therapist should have some awareness that dynamic's existing with the individual and themselves. But at the same time, if a person is really going through a lot of severe symptoms and having difficulty, that's a wonderful, person to rely on more so, with the assumption that they're guiding them in the right direction.
So speaking of therapy, could you touch a little bit on some of the various options that are available for veterans as it relates to PTSD? I know we touched on some cognitive behavioral therapy, exposure therapy, and things like that. What would you say that you've seen for those that don't know what options are available? Like, okay, I got it. I've never spoken about this. I left Vietnam X amount of years ago. I finally understand that it's not that Bill was the way Bill was, but rather Bill has been walking around with this trunk of demons all these years that became his personality, which in reality were, different things he was dealing with. Now he has got a psychological evaluation. He's gone for, a CMP. He's gotten rated, but now the therapy portion begins, right? To begin to unpack and work through that. What are the options when it comes to the therapy out there?
You mean in terms of like the specific types of therapy, or ways?
Yeah, like some of the main things, because some individuals might have PTSD, but not even know, like, now what do I do? What is it? Is it group therapy only? So again, going back to exposure therapy or cognitive behavioral,
Sure.
et cetera.
Sure. Well, I mean, depending on the severity of PTSD and what other kind of diagnosis might be going on, generally starting with individual therapy is, the most effective. And then if a person is able, if there's an existing group that has, members who have similar types of trauma or similar age ranges or similar experiences, then that can be a great thing. Generally speaking, effective PTSD therapy is in stages. I mean, first there's the development of rapport, with the individual. Then there's some general kind of cognitive behavioral strategies that go on that then progress oftentimes to exposure or systematic desensitization. So it's a real progression, and it's something that, if a person chooses to go into therapy, they should really make sure that the person has training or expertise or experience in working with individuals that have those symptoms. I advise people, to seek out people with specific expertise, and really also, I should mention something that's extremely important if a person chooses to enter therapy is finding someone that they connect with. Can be a very difficult thing to do. Logistics of, finances for therapy aside, a good strategy is to identify at least two people, two psychologists with expertise, have a first appointment with each of them so a person can get a basis of comparison for, I like these characteristics or I'm not these, and then you can kind of move forward with more confidence, that there's a good connection or comfort.
So I have a good example for you there, Dr. Swan. I can tell you that. So when I first decided to go seek therapy, the stars aligned. And it was literally the therapist I went to speak with. It happened to be her first week at the practice. She had just transitioned from service. She was a therapist, a psychologist in service, working with, active duty. And this was her first job working in the civilian world. So she essentially had not had non-military personnel. So she thought I had requested her based off her background. And at that time, I was to the point where I was like, I remember distinctively calling in different places, and no one called me back. And this is how horrible sometimes, unfortunate things are. I literally called 3 places, just kind of looked it up, and it was like, leave a message, we'll get back to you. And finally, one called me back, and I'm at, my job. And obviously I'm not going to go into details of what's, I'm trying to talk about. So they're like, well, who do you want to see? A psychologist or a psychiatrist? And at the time I'm like, I don't know who. I'm just trying to talk to someone. And it's like, I could have literally got a root canal faster than getting to see someone. Right. So fast forward, I get in there. And, it was great, right? It was just literally like what needed to happen. But the time came where she had to leave the practice, and what you mentioned happened, right? So that set me back, because what ended up happening was now I began this journey with this person that was helping me go through this. And now I had to reestablish trust again with someone else. And for me, it began a process where that person left, and because I am the way I am, I wanted to go see someone on my own dime. but I also began to use the vet center. So I was in the space of, I don't want to be relying on what you're saying only. I kind of want to have two perspectives, right? And then the private place, the vet center, ended up changing the person they had to. So now two people that I was beginning to, get comfortable with as I was kind of halfway through this journey, all that changed, right? And for me, it set me back because it went through the process of, it's a practice. So people come, people go, and understanding that, being, like you mentioned, right, being able to feel around and having those sessions. So who you feel comfortable with, because if you don't feel comfortable and it's not working, you're not going to show up, and it's going to defeat the purpose. So I think that's a very, very telling point, because I experienced it, and I had to understand that if I don't feel comfortable talking to you, it's not a personal thing. It's just not going to work. This is not like a dentist situation where I don't have to like the drilling, but it has to happen, right?
Right. No, exactly. Exactly. I mean, the comfort level and, just the feeling of connection of being able to talk to someone about difficult things is really one of the strongest predictors for positive treatment outcomes. So, I mean, and that's, that's a really unfortunate thing that happens, is when it's hard enough for a lot of people to get to a point of wanting to go talk to a psychologist, but then they go to talk to one and maybe that person's tested or it's not a good fit, and they just don't choose to go back. So that's something I try to speak to, whenever I'm giving treatment suggestions, just to not let, a bad provider kind of sour things in terms of seeking treatment.
And I think the same applies to a CMP, right? It's one doctor's perspective of what's happening, but it's not the defining moment where now the VA has woken up and said, Chris, we will deny you at every front. It could be many variables. It could be a contracted psychologist that might just not be pro-military or has no business doing what they're doing.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that was a sticking point for me, is finding somebody that I can connect with. Initially, I was looking for somebody who's walked in my shoes, right? I thought that individual only one person could actually understand what I was going through based off my situation. But that wasn't the case. Once I learned that it's really, about being able to manage and handle the symptoms, because I went through cognitive behavioral therapy. That's when I learned that, okay, so because I, like David here, I too had to go through a couple of them, and I wasn't a big fan of that at all. But once I learned that they didn't necessarily, have to have walked in my shoes in order to understand it and what I was going through. So that was important.
Really?
But even when I was in the service and I did seek mental health, I asked, I think I can't remember exactly. It was a major in 04, but she didn't have any operations experience, and I was adamant. So to talk to the colonel, I was like, nope, I can't talk to you. You don't understand where I'm coming from. Not knowing, right? Obviously, but so yeah, finding that connection is huge. But understanding that they don't necessarily have to have walked in your shoes in order to understand what's going on with you and help you.
Yeah, absolutely.
One good point here. So we're going to start wrapping it up here in a few, looking at time. So we're going to have one cue. Then we're going to have Dr. Swan home, who's going to step away, give us a parting tip for our veterans. But one thing I think was interesting, Greg mentioned, I have a hard time explaining that I'm not stable or reliable when I take care of my kids all day. Am I admitting that I am a poor father?
No, I don't think that indicates a person's a poor father. I think that what that indicates is that a person going through or having symptoms of some sort of diagnosis that is interfering, with their ability to be a way that they want to. And the phrase "good father" is hard to specifically define, but I think separating out the symptoms associated with the diagnosis and one's own self-judgment, I think is toward not sort of like increasing those depressive, thoughts.
Mm-hmm. I'd
Hopefully
say
that kind of answers.
no, that does, because what I will share is that, so as many know, I'm in the process of getting a service dog. So that's been a journey that I'm on, and it's coming to a close, and soon my dog would place with me. But part of that process also required to have the conversation with my kids, which is something I don't think I would have ever had to do, because at first, when I looked at my therapies, gumbo, right? There was therapy, but this dog training for my service dog also is part of that therapy. And having to actually have a conversation to say, no, we're not getting a family pet. Rather, this service dog is for dad. And this is because dad has PTSD. For me, that was a paramount moment that would have never happened. So in my journey, having that conversation and being able to talk to my mom and talk to family members about things where it's like, oh, you're gaining, like, well, it's a service dog. I'm like, okay. And then having to educate them on what that means, but having those conversations. But to bring it back to the father perspective, I think that to me was one of those moments where it's like, this is how dad gets better. And acknowledging that I still strive to be a good father, but there are things that I deal with, right? Obviously, the term good is subjective. I've failed in many areas, but it's being transparent to the fact that in life, like we tell our kids, you're going to fail, but get back up. It's no different in this regard, right? There are things that I've dealt with based off what I've done in service and life that brought me to this point where now I'm trying to do something about that, right? Not just get a rating, but actually get help and do something to live life and try to be a good parent.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So Dr. Swanholm, what would be, I said, if there's a person out here who's watching and listening to us that wants to reach out and get a psychological evaluation, or they're on the fence about it, or just ready to go to CMP, what would be some key points that you would give as advice for them, whatever it may be?
Well, it's kind of, feeling, know that this is a safe process. I mean, that I'm pretty easy to talk to, and all the other psychologists are easy to talk to. So the reason I say that is that sort of fear, anxiety about, the word sick in general, or, behavioral health as a phrase. So separating out that sort of stigma from engaging in a positive, process, such as we're involved in, and feeling open to talk to, all of you. Y'all are all wonderful from all the feedback I get. So just trust that there are good people, in this group, certainly. In terms of a C&P, just like I was saying earlier, being open, not kind of pushing things down, but going into the C&P with a good sense of concise sense of what they're going to say. The attention spans of a lot of the C&P examiners is, not as good as you might want it to be. So that's kind of why I'm, giving that advice. Hopefully those are some good tips, but certainly, open to questions if anyone wants to send me an email.
Awesome. No, but thank you, Dr. Tom. Like I said, this is, and I'll tell our viewers that this is one of many, right? These are things that you cannot unpack, in one session. Today, we spoke about one specific thing, primarily chronic pain going into PTSD, and then some various questions. But there's a lot. This is a deep, deep topic that I think, by having faces and having stories and sharing our journey, hopefully motivates someone. Like someone mentioned, for example, that going through from one psych to the next one, they just gave up. But the fact is, don't give up. Find someone, because you owe it to yourself, your family, and those around you to get better.
Absolutely.
Dr. Swanholm, we appreciate you jumping on here with us. We'll stick around for a little bit and answer some questions for the group, like we always do. But as always, it's been a pleasure, Doc. And second time's a charm, good. So we went live.
Hey,
Dr. Swanholm.
Yeah. Hey, good to see you.
Thanks for giving us your time, sir. Appreciate you.
Absolutely.
Thanks for all you do. Thanks for all you do.
Appreciate you guys. Appreciate you all.
Be good.